Hello everyone, this is Jenny here, and we're starting on Unit 7, Working with Diverse People. This unit talks a little bit about culturally and linguistically diverse people, so sometimes that's a term that gets shortened by this acronym CALD or CALD. We'll try not to use that too often. Here are some of the topics that are covered in this unit, and we have 3 assessments. The first one is the knowledge-based written assessment that you will do throughout the week. Then there are 2 case studies, 7.2 and 7.3. 7.1 looks like this, working with diverse people, and you need to just work through those questions. Most of it's in the notes. Sorry about the blank slide there. There's a lot of diversity in Australia, as you know. We are a very culturally diverse country, and this little picture here shows us some of the facts that we could use in question 1 of 7.1 to talk about the variety there is in Australia, the cultural diversity. Here are some more facts from the 2014 census. It's really interesting to see here that over a quarter of all of us in Australia have been born overseas, and almost a half of us all have at least one overseas born parent. So that's an interesting fact there. That means we should be a lot more culturally aware and understanding than we are sometimes in Australia. Our schools are quite diverse too, as you can see here. Over 60% attend government schools in Australia, but we have quite a lot of non-government schools that are for particular cultures. So we have 19 Jewish schools, some Islamic schools, Greek Orthodox schools, and quite a lot of Aboriginal schools in mainly WA, South Australia, Northern Territory. Across Australia we have over 3.5 million students enrolled, or we did in 2015 in schools. Interestingly enough, a quarter of all those students are from language backgrounds other than English. 5.3% of those students are of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander descent, and around Australia the apparent retention rate of all those students from Year 7 right through to Year 12 is 84%, so that's pretty good when you look at that. There's a lot of schools in Australia for overseas students, and these of course will be quite multicultural, as is this St Paul's College you can see in the photo down below. If you are going to provide education for overseas students in Australia, you must be CRICOS registered. That means you are going to be audited and regulated by the Commonwealth Register of Institutions and Courses for Overseas Students, which is CRICOS. And it's interesting to see that Queensland has the highest number of those boarding schools for international or overseas students. Why do we have so many in Australia? There's a lot of reasons, and Australia is a very attractive place for international students, as you can see by that slide there. Where are they all coming from, you might think? What countries are these international students coming from? Here's a little snapshot of where they're coming from, Chinese students being the highest number of all. So let's have a little look at the idea of culture now. Cultures are very diverse in Australia, and just means that people have different beliefs, different ways of living their lives, different shared beliefs and behaviours. And of course culture is rather like an iceberg. You think you can see a person's culture by the outside of them, but a lot of their culture is their actual values, attitudes and the way that they think underneath the surface, like an iceberg. So what is cultural diversity? It's just that pure fact that people choose to live their lives differently than the way we do. There's no one perfect culture in the world. and accepting cultural diversity is important for good relationships in a boarding community. We have a responsibility to respect other cultures and their beliefs, and we have a right to have them respect our cultures and beliefs. And for young people in boarding, you might be the first time that people have shown them respect, because their culture may be very different, and they may experience a lot of discrimination and that sort of things, especially in the past, and that's why they may be migrants or refugees in our country. So we need to provide them a safe environment where we respect their differences and value them as unique young people. Unfortunately, in Australia, it's shown statistically that more than 2/3 of young people have still been victims of racism at school. And sadly, the first generation migrant girls in year 11 and 12 are the most at risk of this. And that can be very hard, very tough on them, and getting through their education as well. What is acculturation? Everybody acculturates in another country or in another culture to some extent. It's when you adapt yourself to fit in with that other culture, and you end up taking on some of the behaviours or values because you are living in that different culture. It's a way of learning about that culture and sort of endeavouring to fit in or get along appropriately in that other culture. But it can be, in school, it can be quite stressful for young students who are culturally diverse from, say, the majority of young people in the boarding. They might feel like, am I being loyal to my family if I change and adapt to fit into this boarding house? And they're often going through that conflicting loyalties where they need somebody to listen to them and guide them and give them strategies to handle this sort of acculturation process, where they may want to change to fit in with other students, or they may not want to, but then they might cop some flack from that. So we need to be aware of this and get to know students and help be available to guide them appropriately as they do this sort of cultural adapting to a different culture in a boarding house. We need to be culturally aware. We need to have that desire and ability to relate positively to people from other cultures. And if you haven't come from that kind of a background, if you're not particularly culturally aware, or you've been brought up fairly monoculturally, or lived most of your life in one culture, how can you increase your cultural awareness? Just by mainly taking time, isn't it, and listening to other people, getting to know them, talk to them, encourage them to share their stories. Volunteering in cross-cultural situations is a great way to do this, or travelling and working overseas, reading stories and watching movies and that of people from other cultures. Because it's good for us, if we all tend to judge other cultures by the norms and standards of our own culture, don't we? We all tend to see the world through our cultural lens, and that's called ethnocentrism. And you can be a little bit ethnocentric, or you can be very ethnocentric. And if you want to decrease that ethnocentrism, then we just need to be really aware of it. Be aware of what is your culture causing, how is it causing you to react, or what parts are coming from your culture and what parts are coming from residence policy and the way you need to work with students. We need to watch out for our words when we're being aware of ethnocentrism, because we can use words that sort of stereotype or alienate young people, like the word normal, all the normal students, but these other students are said to be different to the normal students, and that's not really a fair or a equal sort of way to treat young people. So watch our words and then have that cross-cultural experience, and that can minimise our ethnocentrism. Because we really want to have a culturally appropriate working environment for us and other staff, but also for the young people in our care, we need to have our environment really appropriate for all students from all cultures. We want everybody to have equal and full access equality, be treated equally, and to have full access to everything without any barriers to them being able to participate or receive support or receive equal amount of the resources, that sort of thing. So equality and full access is very important in a boarding residence. And another way that we can ensure that our residence is culturally safe for the young people who are from other backgrounds is to be aware of our own ethnocentrism and just watch that tendency to judge other cultures by the standards of your own and use those wrong words. And we may need to train staff and spend some time in professional development, particularly if the majority of our staff are of a different culture to our students. Then we will need to develop our staff with some cultural awareness training and that sort of thing. The other way we can do this in a boarding is to promote diversity and inclusion, showcase other cultures, celebrate diversity, and really promote inclusion. So that means, we can do things like multicultural days. We can have a variety of meals and in our menu that comes from different cultural backgrounds. We can use a lot of photos and pictures around the walls, or if we have posters, ensure that they've got a variety of culturally diverse people in the photos or the posters, not all that just one monocultural look in them. And the same with our movie selection. Be aware of that when we're selecting movies for students to watch. We can go out of our way to also learn about the culture of our co-workers and our diverse students, and accept that people will have different viewpoints and ways of doing things. There's a good quote down the bottom here where all schools should provide opportunities for their students to engage with other cultures and perspectives beyond that immediate school culture. And boarding houses can be very culturally diverse places, and we need to promote that and encourage inclusion. The other way that we can also make sure of cultural safety in our boarding residence is to consult with cultural brokers. Don't assume that we know everything about the different cultures that are represented. Consult with people who do have a lot of cultural background, or find a support organisation that can share information with us and help us to work with young people from the different backgrounds. We might need to get some information from the immigration department if we're working with young refugees or migrants. We may need to access language interpreters, and in time, hopefully we can develop rapport and trust with the young people through it because of our cultural awareness and our proactive ways of working with them, that we can actually ask them the questions themselves and not have to go to the cultural brokers for everything. We need to be alert to cultural bias, and particularly amongst the young people themselves, where young people might judge some other young people from their own cultural perspective, and then they can end up labelling people and giving them a bad image. Young people from certain cultures might get labelled and treated badly in the residence, and we need to be alert to that and not just stereotype young people from certain backgrounds, because this can lead to discrimination and unfair treatment of some groups if we're not aware of it and stamp it out. May also mean we don't notice a particular need. We might misinterpret a person's behaviour too if we're just seeing it through our own cultural perspective. So what strategies can we use to eliminate bias and discrimination? Here's a few here. Just those things we talked about before, but particularly teaching young people their rights, encouraging them how to speak up and not to just be victims, to ensure our policies are equal, give everybody equal opportunity, and there's no discrimination and that sort of thing. So there's a little questionnaire in 7.1, question 8, just helps us to have a look at our residents and see how multicultural, how aware, how diverse we are in our residents. Our communication is particularly important, and these are just some areas or ways that we need to be culturally aware through our conversations with young people. Develop empathy, show people that we care, that we're interested in hearing their perspective, using simple language, being aware of our volume and speed, and not just getting louder and slower to try and make people understand, because that sounds like we're talking down to them. Using body language, sign language, checking that we're conveying the right message through that, and getting to the point and keeping our conversations brief is really important instead of a long ramble for people who are struggling with another language. This gentleman here, Rabbi David Slavin, said, we have to fight bigotry in our schools and boarding residences. We, there are people in our country who need to be better educated about being culturally accepting, but also young people, we should teach them to stand up for themselves and not allow themselves to be victims. Because in our country we do have laws, and there are federal laws also against discrimination, but in each state there are laws. And one of the laws states that employers must post the definition of discrimination in their workplaces, give employees training in what discrimination is, and also to have a method for an employee to file a complaint if they feel something's discriminatory in their working environment. So that's for staff, but it also flows over into students, because in Australia it's illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of, their nationality or their cultural background in particular. So in our workplaces we should have an equal opportunity policy, particularly where our rules and policies and practices are fair and don't disadvantage some people because they belong to a particular cultural group. We should ensure that we eliminate any barriers that cause inequality in the employment of any person. So that means, anything that's stopping one of your staff from being treated as equal as everybody else, we all have a responsibility to act to prevent that kind of discrimination, and we need to all take responsibility to respect each other, recognise the skills and talents of others, and treat each other fairly. So let's do 7.2, have a quick look at that right now. If you pulled out 7.2 and had a look at it, you'd see that there's a scenario here in an urban boarding school where group of supervisors have worked together for a long time and they're very culturally the same, but along comes a new staff worker who is from a very different cultural background, and they don't understand her, and they inadvertently mostly tend to sort of put barriers up for her being included as an equal in the workplace. So I want you to have a look at that, the rights and responsibilities of an employee under that equal opportunity policy that we talked about a few minutes ago. Check when you're answering this scenario how we can work against any language barriers. She can speak English, this lady, but her English may have a strong accent, and she may not really understand our accent either, so our communication can cut both ways. So we need to find ways we can appreciate her diversity and work with her. So see how you go with 7.2. And the last little section here is about cross-cultural difficulties and how they can create conflict in a workplace. A lot of the time we're not aware that our culture is acting on us, because we have different communication styles, we have different attitudes towards conflict or completing tasks, making decisions, all those things. We may do them differently just because we're from different cultural backgrounds. So if there's conflict in the workplace, we need to think, could our cultures be shaping our reactions, and try and see it from the other person's point of view. This gentleman called Thomas Kilman, these two gentlemen made up a conflict mode instrument where helps you to identify which style you tend to use when conflict arises. And just have a little look at this. It's just a tool you can think about. There's lots of, lots of different ways of understanding conflict styles. Some people, when there's a bit of conflict going on, they become very competitive. When there's disagreement, they stand firm and they know what they want and they're very firm and competitive. Other people, they just want to cooperate and include everybody and they're very collaborative. Another person might compromise and try to find a solution that satisfies everybody, or accommodating and giving in to the other person at the expense of their own opinion. Or some people might just evade conflict, avoid it altogether, try and delegate the decision to somebody else because we don't want to argue about this or we don't want to get into a disagreement, so they just avoid conflict. So think about the way that you handle conflict in the workplace, particularly if it's cultural, based on a cultural perspective. Because, we all have this slight cultural bias, as we said before, and we were socialised by our parents and by our environment, by a school we went to, and we might not even realise that we have these misunderstandings between us and another person of a different culture. There are two tools here just to end with that we can use to resolve conflict, and one is the restorative approach. We talked about this a bit in Unit 4, facilitating responsible behaviour. So I hope you've been able to have a think about how you could use that restorative approach in conflict between staff. And then there's another one called the IBR approach, or the Interest-Based Relational approach. I'll just refresh your memory about the restorative approach and ask us if you want any of these restorative question cards. We can get them to you. Helping adults in conflict to think about who's been affected, what's happened, and what you can do to make things right is really important, as much as with young people. The interest-based relational approach is a bit similar, really. It just goes through these 5 steps to make sure before you bring people together who've been in conflict that you set the scene really clearly and talk about relationships being the first priority. And we're going to keep our discussion calm and courteous, and we're not going to confront each other, but we're going to try and keep the problems separate so that we can gather information. In step 2, listen to each other and try and understand the other person's position as well, then agree on the problem. Step 3, let's agree, what is the actual problem here? Let's try and really write it down or label it, name it, and listen to the other person as to what they see as the problem. And then put the problem there on the table, name it, describe it, and then explore options together to find even the possibility that neither of you has to be wrong. There might actually be a third position that you can agree on, and then you negotiate what solution you're going to use. So trying to find a win-win solution that satisfies each of the parties. And then maybe that third position or a slight compromise from both sides where they can actually both feel that they've had a bit of a win in the way that they've resolved the conflict. So then just to finish, there's 7.3, and in 7.3 we have a couple of culturally different house parents working together, and they get into conflict mainly because of their different way of dealing with student behaviour. And one has been in the residence longer than the other, one's older than the other, but they also have this different kind of cultural approach to working with the young people. So think about that and try again to use either the interest-based relational approach or this restorative approach when you try and resolve the conflict between these 2 staff members in 7.3. And that's the end. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.